Good morning, class. My name is Craig Yarborough, and I'm coming in. I know that y'all have already got your property under contract. You're going into your getting ready to close on a property, and I've been asked to talk to you about closing procedures and what you need to do once you go under contract. I know that as a review that you've already talked about the basic sales contract concepts and the preparation and procedures to get to where we're going to talk about today. And so what we're going to talk about is the closing preparations, procedures. We're going to talk about what you need to do to educate your buyers in order to get from the contract to the settlement table and to the closing. We're going to talk about the difference in settlement and closing, because I want you to be prepared, and you need to be prepared to talk to your buyers once you go under contract about what happens. And why.
All right.
What constitutes a closing? You know, you have already been through the process. You've already shown property. You have already gone over all of this. You've negotiated the deal, and now you're getting ready to go to your closing table. And you need to make sure that your buyers are ready and know what do they need to do in order to get there. Because you know that as a broker and as a provisional broker, the one thing that we all need to be prepared for is the fact that it is our responsibility. Not only do we show property, not only do we negotiate the deal, but it is our responsibility to make sure that the buyers get everything they need. Our fiduciary duty does not end with the buyer until after we have settled the deal and that they have closed on their property and ready to move into the new home, or if you're representing the seller, that their property has sold and they've collected their checks at the end of the deal. So what we're going to do is the legal process that culminates in the transfer of title from the seller to the buyer. We're going to go through all the process that it takes and what happens during this time frame. We're going to talk about the completion of the title update, the permission from the lender to disperse loan funds, and then the actual closing, which is the recordation of the deed and deeds of trust, and then the disbursement of sales proceeds. Closing is the transfer of the title is now complete. Everything that we have worked towards is now finalized. And that is what we're going to talk about, and that's what we're going to work with our buyers and our sellers to make sure that everything that we need to do is ready in order to get this complete so everybody can move on with their lives. After signing the contract and before the closing, the first thing that we need to educate our buyers is selecting the closing attorney. We all know that in North Carolina that we prefer that we use attorneys to close our real estate deals. In some cases that we do allow title companies in North Carolina that can close. The preferred method is through an attorney. If you have a title company that you wish to use and that you use, you just have to make sure there are certain things and guidelines that are followed, because if a non-attorney is closing the real estate deal, they have to make sure that they don't discuss certain things that are legally have to be discussed by an attorney. But we do allow that. But typically in North Carolina, what we're going to deal with is closing attorneys, and we need to make sure that we help our clients deal with selecting an attorney in order to move forward. That should be the first thing that is done once you get a contract, because they begin the process. The second thing that has to be done is your lender. You have to make sure that the lender, this should already have been completed before you ever even get into a contract, because they have to be pre-approved. And so those two are the first two people that you need to make sure that your clients are ready to deal with, because it's not until after contract that your lender can actually begin the loan process. They can give you the generics for as far as how much they're approved for and all the other information, and make sure that they meet all the criteria. But once they have the contract is when they begin to collecting and you fill out your application. And the application is a process in which they complete all the information that is needed for the lender to move forward. And so doing, when we select the attorney, you have to provide the attorney with an offer to purchase and contract. You have to provide them with all the contact information for the seller and the buyer. This is because there is certain information that we have to collect that we're responsible for as far as social security numbers, copies of old deeds, copy of title companies, the policy that they have in place right now. All of this information has to be collected and given to the closing attorney. Because of different scams that are happening today, we do not collect that information anymore. We no longer collect emails that have people's social security numbers, that have their loan information. This is information that we ask that they collect directly by the attorney. Either the attorney calls them or they're going to call the attorney and give this information. But we give them a sheet that actually has all the information that is needed. Some of it we collect and we will fill out and that we forward to the attorney. You've probably already done some of this because you've already been doing some real estate deals and you're aware of it. But please be careful and make sure that you are not collecting personal information via email and then relaying this information to the attorney, because you can be hacked. Attorneys can be hacked. And so a lot of this information now, because of the email scams, I'm just telling you and recommending to you that for your own safety and for the safety of your clients, that you go ahead and let some of this information be collected by the attorney, and that you just put them in touch with each other and make sure that they get this on their own. What information do you provide to the attorney? We've already talked about some of it, but if you're representing the seller or the buyer, and the seller have done repairs, you need to make sure that all of the invoices for all these repairs have been collected by the attorney to make sure they're paid for at closing. You need to make sure that all the inspection reports. What inspections are you going to do? That's up to you to help recommend and help your buyer and your seller to be aware of what's going to happen. We all know that usually the very first ones we order are home inspections. Home inspections are important because the home inspector goes in and they're going to nitpick and tear the house apart for everything that they can find, or as far as what they find on the house. And I mean, sometimes you're even going to get down to where a doorknob is loose, and etc. I mean, some of it gets down, but you got to understand that the home inspector is coming in and representing the buyer, and what they're telling you is every single thing that they can find. Now, they are not contractors, so we all need to remember that when a home inspector goes in and inspects, they're just going to tell you that this item didn't work. The HVAC didn't work, it didn't register, the heater, the air didn't work the way that it's supposed to per North Carolina standards. They're going to tell you this outlet didn't work, this outlet is loose. And they're going to tell you that they recommend that you get contractors or inspectors that are licensed in those fields to go back and verify it, because they can't verify that information because they are not licensed in those areas. So you got to make sure that you get all of these things ordered and done. Pest inspections, we know pest inspections need to be done for all property. In most cases, I even recommend that you never tell a client not to get an inspection. Whether there's a bond on the home and they're protected for as far as termites, have the house inspected. And VA, if you have a VA loan, they're going to require it anyway. And with VA, it's a required expense by the seller. So you need to keep up with these things and make sure that you're staying on top of these things. These are things that you are responsible for. Now, when it comes to all of these, including your attorney, do you recommend 1, 2, 3? Sometimes if you just have an attorney or an inspector that you work with, you're allowed to recommend that one. But make sure that you are not collecting any referral fees from the attorney or home inspectors. We cannot receive kickbacks in any form at all from these people. It's just a matter of a working relationship that you may have in order to move the process along quicker and easier. I usually recommend that you may have a couple of attorneys you recommend, that you may have a couple of home inspectors that you use and that you recommend. Just make sure that whoever it is that you use, that they're reputable, they're licensed, and that they can move everything forward to keep things in the process. You've got to make sure that the buyer's loan information is given to the attorney. They have to know who they're going to be dealing with for as far as the loan. You have to make sure that anything that's being paid by at closing by the buyer is being taken care of. It's surveys, inspections, appraisals. How many of you deal now with appraisals and that they're prepaid? Most of us. Very seldom now do you have an appraiser that goes out and appraises property. They collect money at closing. Most appraisals are prepaid. There are some instances where the lender may collect credit card information, and that they may actually wait until the end and not charge the buyer for it until closing. It goes on the closing disclosure. That's rare, but it does happen. The reason for it is because what they may do is just wait because of the seller's paying the closing expenses. They just don't see a need in billing the buyer's credit card today, and what they'll do is wait and let it come out at closing. But if the buyer terminates the contract for whatever reason, then they'll go ahead and bill their credit card, because even if the contract is terminated, the buyer is still responsible for paying for an appraisal. They're responsible for paying for all their home inspection, any inspection. So most of your inspections now are prepaid, or they're not prepaid. All the inspectors are collecting credit card information so that they can run that card should the buyer terminate the contract. So you need to make sure that you're educating your buyers on all of that information. And while we're on that subject, I have a brochure here that's printed through the Real Estate Commission. And what I'm going to do is pass these out. I just kind of want y'all to take a look at these. This kind of goes along with what we're talking about today. And that you will have this, because this is a good brochure that you should actually sit down and go through with your buyer at the time of contract, so that they're aware of everything that goes on and what their responsibility is and what your responsibility is in order to assist in getting them there. Once you give your contract to the attorney, you're going to establish a temporary settlement date. Maybe it's a permanent one, maybe not. Because we all know that during the time that once you go under contract until settlement, anything can happen. You've got repairs that need to be done that may not be able to get done in time, and you need to postpone settlement. Maybe there's an issue with a credit that needs to be taken care of, a job, employment verification. The seller may have some issues that arise with the title work, where there's a cloud on a title that needs to be fixed. There are numerous things that can come up, and we all know that even though we set a date to close, a lot of times that date cannot be met. So we're going to set a temporary, a date that may be met or may not, but can be changed. And while we're talking about the dates and so forth, we already know that those dates that our contracts have a period of 14 days that is built in, so that if you meet those days, and you're diligently trying to move forward to closing in order to get you there, that we have a 14-day period in our contract that is given to you that you can meet. And if you can't meet that, then you have to get a change of contract form done and extend your closing date. Everybody understand that process? Is there any questions about what we've talked about up till now? If there's not, then we're going to move on to your due diligence period and exactly what is going to happen during your due diligence period. All the tasks that we have kind of talked about have to be done during your due diligence period. Most often our due diligence periods are anywhere from 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Sometimes I've had buyers request a longer due diligence period. Again, that's a negotiated thing at the beginning, but we've already gotten beyond that. We're into our due diligence period. And you need to make sure that all the material facts have been disclosed. Please make sure you do your due diligence during this period as well. We need to make sure as brokers, and hopefully a lot of this was done prior to contract, but you need to make sure that during the due diligence period that we have verified that all material facts have been noted and that we know of any problems that may arise, anywhere from air conditioning issues or HVAC issues, anything dealing with lead-based paint, anything dealing with a hot topic today are buried gas tanks and oil tanks. You know, we live on the coast, and back in the day, we have a lot of our older homes that still have buried oil tanks. And these are material facts that we need to make sure that are disclosed. One of the biggest things that I run in today, and I still run into it, I know that you're running into it, are issues dealing with septic systems. Because a lot of homes today still have our septic systems, and they converted a garage to a 4th bedroom. And in so being, now they've taken a 3-bedroom house to a 4-bedroom house. And they think, well, I didn't really change the number of bathrooms. Well, in North Carolina, we don't look at the number of bathrooms. We look at the number of bedrooms that are in there, because we classify as 2 heartbeats per bedroom. So if you've gone from a 3-bedroom house, 6 heartbeats, to a 4-bedroom house, 8 heartbeats, it's the amount of time that you're using the bathrooms and the water usage and the toilet uses. So you've got to make sure that all of this has been corrected and done through the correct process. And if you have a septic system, you've got to make sure you go through the health department, make sure it's been upgraded and there's been any change in it. And not only those, but other issues that arise. We have communities in Wilmington and the surrounding counties that they might be on a community-based system, but the community system is based on the same thing as a septic system. You've got X number of houses that have 4 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. And so the system is built for that capacity. And so now that they've converted rooms, they could still be overusing that system that could cause problems. And you have got to make sure, and you verify during the due diligence, that you do your part in making sure that the home that you've got under contract falls within the realm of what is supposed to be there. And so that is our responsibility as brokers, if we continue this relationship with our buyers and sellers. Buyer's loans. Help buyers. You know, unless you have a buyer that has sold and bought multiple homes, my guess is that they are scared. Even somebody who's already bought and sold a home, this is still a huge expense. And it's something that they're still not aware of exactly the process and what is supposed to happen. I can tell you, when I bought my house 20 years ago, I had an agent that was excellent in helping me get to where I needed to be. She did everything right by the book. She helped me as far as attorney. She helped me with inspections. But there are a lot of people out there that when you ask them about when they bought their last home and how the deal went, it didn't go so well, because they didn't feel like that their agent helped them through that process, or didn't even understand the process themselves. And so that's why you want to be the agent that goes above and beyond and make sure you do all of your due diligence, and that includes helping the buyers with their loan. Now, that doesn't mean that you get into their personal business and their personal finances. I do not do that. But I have built a relationship with a few mortgage people that I usually recommend to my buyers that they use. And I can pick up the phone and I can call and I can ask that person how things are going and making sure that all the paperwork that they need, that they have, that they're not missing anything. And it's my responsibility to make sure that they're not overlooking something that may be overlooked. Now, I know that seems kind of strange, but, you know, mortgage brokers are not working on just one loan. No more than you're probably working on one buyer or with one seller. So they've got a lot going on too. And so you want to make sure that you work with the mortgage people and make sure that they have all the paperwork. Because what is an item that typically might get overlooked till the end? Anybody want to speculate? I will tell you it's going to be page 13. Because a lot of times we go under contract and the buyers have 5 days to get earnest money. And so a lot of times we will collect earnest money and then we've got to make sure that that contract page 13, is signed, and we got to make sure that the attorney gets signed page 13 and the lender gets page 13. Because then what will happen is we're a week or two away from closing and all of a sudden they're calling and saying, I need page 13. You have it. You've done everything you're supposed to do. You just forgot to forward it to the two people who need it for closing, the attorney and your lender. So just being that person who goes and does the above and beyond for your client is going to set you above a lot of other brokers that are out there. So let's make sure that you stay in touch and that you work with your buyers and sellers to make sure that they get all the information that is needed. Your buyers should make sure that they don't deal with just one mortgage broker at first. But this should, to me, this should be something that has already been done before contract. By the time you have a contract, they should be pretty settled on their mortgage broker so they can go ahead and do their application and move forward. But sometimes they may speak to them, they may think that they've already found the one they want to use, and then after they do the application, there might be something that showed up that the credit score wasn't not as high as it was at first. Maybe the mortgage person didn't run their credit, they just did a pre-approval, and so their credit wasn't done, and now all of a sudden they find out that their credit score is lower, or that something came up that wasn't on there before, and so maybe they do need to go out there and check with other mortgage people and see different loans that are available to them. We should all keep in mind all of these different issues. Okay? Any questions up till now? Appraisals is one of the big things that have to be ordered up front. As soon as a loan application is done and the process is in the beginning, one of the first things that the lender is going to do is order the appraisal. Usually it's paid outside closing, which is POC, and it's going to show up on your closing disclosure as a POC, unless what we talked about earlier, where they collect credit card information and they wait and see whether or not the deal closes and collects it at the end based on whether or not the seller is paying their closing costs. But things that the appraisers do is they may make a home subject to. So the house may appraise at $250,000, but the $250,000 appraisal may be based on whether or not there are certain things that have to be done to the home to bring it up to standards. And so we got to make sure that we work with them to make sure that we get this home there. Surveys. A lot of times today we don't do surveys. A lot of the new communities, because of the way that the land is platted out and it's all so easy to mark, that we may not do surveys. A lot of the older homes, because they're big and there are several communities here, one Pine Valley, because everybody knows Pine Valley in Wilmington, it's a big subdivision. It started back in the late 50s, And it's, matter of fact, there's some new homes still being built on some of the land today, but for the most part, Pine Valley was finished in the mid-70s. But they're all half-acre lots. Some of them are bigger, some of them are just a hair smaller. But for the most part, you're going to be anywhere in a half-acre range in Pine Valley. But who knows where the boundaries are? A lot of people don't have fences. And so it's up to you to make sure that you recommend that it might be worth $600 or $700 to a surveyor to go ahead and get this property surveyed. Because you do not want your buyer to buy a property and then all of a sudden they call you and say, hey, I was going to put up a fence and I got my property surveyed and I found out that my neighbor's fence is 1.5 feet in my property. What am I supposed to do? Well, that's something that should have been approached before you closed on it, because it was the seller's responsibility to go to their neighbor and tell them, we need to work something out on the fence. Because you should have had a survey, and that should have something that would have shown up at the time the survey did, because now your title insurance company, they're not going to protect you against an encroachment that wasn't discovered then. You have to make sure that is something that is done before you close on the property in order to negotiate it during your due diligence period. Insurance. Believe it or not, there are some homes that your buyer is not going to be able to get insurance for. It's based on how many claims have been made in the past. Sometimes the insurance companies have ruled that a property is uninsurable because of age and because of it has not been renovated. For whatever reason, there are some homes out there that clients go into and they try to get insurance, but it's been marked as uninsurable because of the amount of claims that have been filed on that property. So you need to know this, and you need to find this out during due diligence. This is not something that you want to wait until 2 days before closing or 4 days because of getting your CD out. You don't want to wait till the very end to get property insurance. You want to make sure that you've got this process done and you're working with your buyers to make sure that the house is insurable and they get insurance on the home so that the binder can be sent over to the attorney and the lender so that we can move forward with this process. Flood insurance. The map's just been done. We all know that flood maps have been, new flood maps have come out as far as our area, and there's some areas that have been improved as far as the flood, and there's some areas that are now in the flood map that were not before. So you can't just ask and base your information on what's in the MLS. You are responsible to make sure and to verify if the property is not in a flood zone or is in a flood zone, so that you can recommend to your buyer as far as flood insurance and whether or not they're moving forward with this based on how much the flood insurance is. I had a client. He is in a flood zone. He knows he's in a flood zone. But when we bought the house, he had to pay $7,000, I think, maybe $9,000 for flood insurance for the first year, because the house was in an area where there had not been a policy that was transferable. Because we know that if a seller currently has flood insurance on it, we can transfer that policy. He was the first person to buy the house and finance it. None of the previous owners had ever had flood insurance. So here he is in the middle of it, and we find out that he's got to pay, I think it was almost $9,000, and the figure's immaterial right now. But the point is that we discovered it during due diligence so that he could determine whether or not he wanted to move forward with it or not, and he did. But he contacted the insurance company, and he found out what he needed to do over the course of a year or two so that he could reduce that and make it the house up to terms for the new flood policy so that he could reduce his policy. And now his policy is a whole lot less than what he started with, and he's very happy with it. But what do you think he would have done if we had waited till 2 weeks before close, and all of a sudden we found out that he had to pay $9,000 for flood insurance? He wouldn't have been very happy. But the fact that we found out the first 5 days and he'd had time to make a decision on whether or not he wanted to move forward or not, I had done my part. And that's what you all need to do when you're representing buyers. Don't put any of this stuff off thinking you've got time. 30-day close, 45-day closing, they sneak up on you when you're busy doing other stuff. And you've got to make sure that you're helping your client walking through. You're going to have a lot of first-time home buyers that have no experience, and they're depending on you to get them there. Inspections, one of the first ones we do is going to be pest inspections. We all have companies that we like to work with. You may use any of them that you choose to, but just make sure that you recommend to your client that they get a pest inspection. I don't care if the house has a bond on it. Just because they have a bond and this guy walks around and sprays does not mean that that house does not have any issues with termites. Now, understand that the pest inspection that we do typically deals with termites. Now, they might note boar ants and different things, but the main thing that we're looking at is termite damage and anything that they might have had past termite and damage that's been done. And you need to make sure that this is done. If you had VA, all VA is going to require pest inspections. I don't care whether or not there's been a bond on the house at the day it was built. And it is a seller paid item. The seller is responsible for paying for pest inspections on VA loans. Even new construction, I recommend to my clients that they get a pest inspection, even though when they built the property there was a 10-year warranty based on the spray where they have guaranteed for 10 years. You need to make sure that you go ahead and get a termite pest inspection done on it. Do not recommend. If your client makes a decision that they don't want one, don't let it be based on your recommendation. Make sure they make that on their own. Make sure that your client has done a physical inspection. Make sure that there's all inspections done, home inspection. Make sure that you know about tenants and leases. When a tenant is living in a premises, don't you need to know how much longer they had there before your client can move in? Or if he's buying it as an investment property, how long does he have with this person before they can move out? You want to know all of these things, so you need to make sure you review copies of all of the lease agreements and make sure that you understand what's going on in place. You need to make sure that you need to know what improvements or what has been done by the tenant that they may be planning on taking with them that is not owned by the seller. I actually had a deal sometime back over the last several years where the seller agreed to leave the washing machine and dryer in a property. And the tenant was living there and they were on a month-to-month and they were moving out. Well, during our process, when we went in and doing inspections, it turned out that the washing machine and dryer did not belong to the landlord, it belonged to the tenant. And they asked us why we were having it inspected because they were taking it with them. Well, do you not think that's something we needed to address real quick during our due diligence period? Now, in our case, we weren't under due diligence. At that time, we were just doing a date for inspections and periodically everything was done by dates then. But it was something that we discovered during our inspections that we were able to go back to the owner of the property and negotiate something because they were supposed to leave the washing machine and dryer. In our case, they actually bought a washing machine and dryer to go into the home. But it's something that we found out during our inspection period that we need to make sure we do. Any repairs that are done to the property, you need to make sure that it's been paid or there's an invoice with the attorney to be collected at the time of closing so that all of that is taken care of. If there's major renovations, make sure they have building permits done. What are things that we need to make sure they're building permits for anyway? Plumbing, electrical. These are things that you need to make sure that they have had building permits issued. and the fact that they've all been inspected, they're approved before you move on. We talked about the sewage disposal systems, septic systems. You need to make sure that those are all done, and they're done per the health department to make sure that you don't run into any issues after closing. The last thing you need to find out after closing is you got a 4-bedroom house, and all of a sudden the septic system is backing up, and they call you because everything was supposed to be fine, to find out the septic system for a 3-bedroom house. Wells and water quality. Make sure, I don't ever recommend that your client not do a chemical test on a well. Tell them it's available. They may choose not to do so. That is up to them, not you. Because I can tell you now, as of I think January of this year, that VA requires that all wells and septic systems be checked before closing, to make sure the water quality and make sure the septic system's working and that it is for running the way it's supposed to. Now, the septic people are not checking to verify that it's a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom. That is your responsibility. But these are things that we have to make sure. Make sure your environmental, lead. We know that if the house was built prior to 1978, one is you've got an addendum that was in the contract that specified, and whether or not your buyer's going to move forward with lead inspections or they're accepting the house as is. But you need to make sure that they know that there is a test available to go in and let somebody check, especially if they have a child that has certain allergies that they need to make sure of for as far as lead. So make sure you do what you're supposed to with these things. I'm going to skip radon for a minute and come to asbestos, because we know that we have some of the historical homes in Wilmington. And we know that with the historical homes in Wilmington that there is asbestos. We know that there is asbestos tiles on the outside. We know they have asbestos in some of the ceilings and the tile that were used. But it's a material fact that we have to disclose asbestos. So make sure. Now, asbestos is not dangerous as long as we leave it alone. So if your client's looking at covering or redoing the outside of a house that has asbestos, they need to go in, and they're either going to have to pay somebody for asbestos removal who knows what they're doing, or they can cover it and leave it alone. But make sure that you're aware of asbestos, because that is a material fact. Radon. Radon is a new one in North Carolina, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've lived here my whole life. I've lived right here, you know, with a few exceptions and stuff, but I've lived right here. This is my home. I was born and raised here. Never have I heard of Wilmington having a radon issue until a few years ago. And it's kind of like, wow, where did this come from? We all know that radon gas is something that you cannot smell, so there's no odor. We know that there's no way of us just walking into a house and knowing there's radon. It is a test that we need to perform for radon. We used to, and we used to tell people we live in Wilmington, there's no need to worry about radon. Do not do that. It is our responsibility to make sure that we discuss radon gas with all of our clients, and the fact that it is dangerous, and the fact that there are health issues involved in radon, and that if they wish to have a test, that you recommend somebody to go in and do the test. Now, there are things that have to be done to do a radon test, but that's something that we deal with. We just order a radon test and then let the inspection people go in, and then they dictate as far as the process and what needs to be done. But there are a lot of reported cases now in the eastern part of North Carolina concerning radon and radon poisoning. So we need to make sure that we make that test available to all of our clients. The easier one is when we take a listing, is to go ahead and tell the seller that this is a possibility and that they may want to go ahead and get a radon test before a buyer comes on board, and then they can show them the report. Now, why? because in most instances, when you have to do radon testing, the place has to be vacated. You gotta seal the windows, you gotta do certain things, and the place really does not need to be habitated for a few days while they're doing the test. So what I think would be great is the fact that you tell your sellers that they should go ahead and get one done and have it ready and available for buyers. But if they don't, then go ahead and make sure that your buyers are aware of it. And if they choose not to have one, make sure they sign off that they are rejecting that inspection. Any inspections that they don't want, you need to make sure that they sign off on. I use the professional services disclosure that's in the zip form on every buyer and seller, and I tell you whose responsibility it is, and I recommend different companies, and it's up to them to accept or reject. And then I have myself covered for as far as who says they want an inspection or not an inspection. You should be doing the same thing. Make sure that you use that form. Mostly for buyers. I recommend it for buyers and sellers, but definitely you should have that for your buyers. It protects you when you have recommended something and they say, no, I don't want it. We need to make sure that during our due diligence period that we have time that we can negotiate repairs. Any issues that came up on our repairs, we need to make sure we do a repair request and that we send it off for approval. Now, do repairs have to be done during your due diligence period? No. All we gotta do is make sure that they're negotiated. How long do they have to do the repairs? Up until closing. By closing, all the repairs should be done so that we can have it re-inspected and verify the work's been done. But all we need to do is make sure that during our due diligence period that we've done the inspections and that we've negotiated repairs. During your due diligence, you need to make sure that your buyer has reviewed and seen a copy of any HOA restrictions and their fees, how much is due. You know, because I can tell you in the MLS, sometimes I've seen HOA fees, $1,200 a year, $100 a month, no big deal. But guess what? That's only for the POA. Because you got subdivisions here in Wilmington or in New Hanover County, Pender County, Brunswick County, that are huge that have POAs that everybody pays this fee. But then every property is in a certain subdivision within that subdivision, and they are bound by the covenants and restrictions of that subdivision. And what they fail to tell you is that there's actually another HOA that they've got to pay for. So this is something that you need to make sure of and that we have reviewed with all of our buyers and sellers to make sure that everything is itemized, that we have disclosed everything, and make sure your buyers have seen and they're happy with the HOA covenants and restrictions, because you don't want them to find out that they can move into a subdivision, but then they plant petunias in their front yard and they find out that petunias are not an approved flower. Or they hang a flag on their front column to find out they can't have flags. And believe it or not, there are some subdivisions, not only do they not allow you to put a flagpole in the front yard, they don't allow you to put one of those little decorative flagpoles on their columns so you can have no flags. And your buyers need to be made aware of these things during their due diligence period to make sure that they know. Make sure you've reviewed zoning. How do you think that people feel that are up off the new military cutoff extension? Do you think that every one of them were made aware that when military cutoff extension was approved, that their houses were going to be affected? Maybe not through eminent domain where the state bought them and tearing them down, but that now their backyards are going to back up to a major thoroughfare. Now, if they lived up there prior to any of this being done, that's different, because there are some places that might have been around way before military cutoff was even discussed. And even in some defense, that there were 5 different proposed areas for military cutoff to go. And it wasn't until they ruled it down and then finally decided on the final 1 or 2. But we should have been doing our due diligence to make sure that we advised our buyer, this is a possibility, this is coming. The state has approved it, We may not know exactly where it's going, but it's coming, and you need to make sure you're aware of this if you're happy with it. Those are things that we do during our due diligence issue, and we're supposed to make sure that we resolve issues that come up during due diligence. That is our job, our responsibility to make sure with our buyers and our sellers that any issues that arise, that we're there to help them resolve so that we can get to the settlement table. Title search. Who does title search in North Carolina? The attorneys do. How long does it take? It depends. Depends on how many subdivision is, depends on how many times the house has been sold or bought. But the point is that there are 3 stages of title search in North Carolina. 3. There's the first title search, which is we call it a 2-year chain of title. That's what my lender uses, 2-year chain of title. And usually what happens is when we get a contract, we send it over. The first thing she asks the attorney is to give them a 2-year chain of title. That is not a full title search. It does not clear title, but what it does, it gives the lender to make sure how long these people have owned it, and make sure that over the last 2 years, anything that's been done, that there's no liens or issues that can pop up over the last 2 years. So they do a 2-year chain of title. And then the attorney does a full title search once they have the contract, and they do this before closing during the 30-day, 45-day period, and before the final closing disclosure, they do a full title search. And then that's when they write their letter for the title company for as far as whether or not there's issues and whether or not they can write a title policy. So there's the second search. The third and final one actually comes after settlement. Before anything is recorded, they will do a final title search to make sure that nothing comes up on that title before the property is transferred to their client, the buyer. You got to make sure that any defects in title are settled by the seller and that they are made aware of any issues that might come up. A lot of them that come up are old deeds of trust or old loans that have been out there and satisfied, but the previous seller or the previous loan was not removed. Sometimes it's just easy things like equity lines on a property that have been paid off and they still show out there as active even though they've been paid. We just need to get all those things cleared up and make sure that the mortgage deed of trust is ready for as far as transfer. Any outstanding leases, we need to make sure that we're aware of those. We need to make sure that we have been made aware of how long the lease is, what's going to happen, make sure the tenants are aware the property is being sold. The final things that we're doing is make sure that just before closing, you've gone through all your inspections, you're done with your due diligence, and here you are, final pre-closing procedures, and you've got your earnest money. When is earnest money transferred over to an attorney? Anybody guess? 10 days. As early as 10 days before closing, can you transfer earnest money from the trust account to the attorney's trust account? Now, sometimes we no longer do that. A lot of times, if the company is holding the earnest money, a lot of times the attorney will just deduct that from the commission, and the brokerage companies will hold it, transfer it out of their trust account to their operating expense, and that way they're avoid having to write a check, transfer it over, or wire it over to the attorney's trust account. But we're allowed to do all of that work or checks if they're being cut 10 days in advance, no sooner than 10 days. You need to make sure that any closing disclosures that are provided, that are discussed with buyers and sellers, all before. One of those is what? Your closing disclosure. When do closing disclosures go out? A minimum of 3 days before closing. Now, we need to talk about closing disclosures and that process, because it's no longer can you get a closing disclosure and close the day of closing. Now closing disclosures are 3 days out, and when you talk about 3 days out, If you send it out on Thursday and they sign it on Thursday, Thursday is day 1. Friday is day 2. Saturday is day 3, and you can close on Monday. Saturday is a working day, classified a working day, and you can count it as one of your 3 business days. Sunday is not. So Sunday is not counted as a day of your 3 days. If you send out a closing disclosure on Friday, and it's signed on Friday, you can count Friday, Saturday, Monday, and you can close on Tuesday. Now, if the closing disclosure goes out on Friday, and your buyer doesn't sign it until Saturday, Saturday starts your 3-day window. It is Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, and you can close on Wednesday. So please make sure you keep in mind that 3-day window for closing. What about sellers? Closing disclosure. Do they have a 3-day window? No. That window does not apply to sellers. They can get it the morning of, they get it the day before, whatever. But it does not apply to sellers, so we're not as concerned about them getting their closing disclosure as we are the buyers. The sellers just need to have theirs to review the numbers and make sure the numbers are accurate and that they're happy. As a buyer and a seller agent, you should review both. Please do not make assumptions. If you are a selling agent, you want to make sure you see the buyer's closing disclosure to make sure, and the sellers, to make sure that the money, if you're given $5,000 in closing costs, by all means, make sure that you tally up all the closing costs for the buyer to make sure that there's $5,000. The worst thing you can do for your seller is to allow a $5,000 closing figure to be put and given credit to the buyer, but they only had $4,400 worth of closing costs, because that is $600 that belongs to your seller. The flip side is to make sure on the buy side is the fact that you're using all of the money. Make sure you've got to verify that your agent has got to see all of the closing costs that are being charged to the seller, to make sure, because if all of a sudden the buyer is still responsible for $1,500 of closing costs, you've got to make sure that you have used all of it. Make sure that all the invoices have been put on the closing disclosure. You've got to verify these numbers. It is part of our due diligence. It is part of our responsibility to do that. It's something that you need to make sure that you do. You've got to make sure that you tell your buyers how much money needs to be wired to the attorney. Most attorneys no longer accept cashier checks unless they're less than $5,000. Some even say $2,000, but most of it's wired. And we already talked about the fact that we do not give the wiring information to our buyers. We have them contact the attorney, and the attorney does that directly with them. So make sure that you go over all these things and make sure they understand the closing disclosure. Lenders now send out closing disclosures different from before. It used to be the attorneys did it all, and that the lender would approve it, send it back to the attorney sent it out. That doesn't happen today. In most cases, the attorney now sends the lender all of their costs. The lender puts it together. The lender will send it to the attorney to make sure they verify numbers, to make sure it's all right. It goes back to the lender, and then the lender sends it out to the buyer for approval. Now, I have discussed the fact the 3-day window, but you do realize that sometimes lenders do not do that. Sometimes they mail it or they email it. And when they do that, there's a 10-day window for accepting it. So sometimes, and you will find that a lot with credit unions and for some of your government things like USAA and Navy Fed, if you're asking to work for those people, that they don't send it out personally, what's classified personal. What they do is they put it in the mail and mail it to you, and they give you a 10-day window. So you need to make sure that you're aware of how everybody is receiving closing disclosures and making sure it's well within the norm and making sure make sure a title insurance policy is issued, because what you want to do is make sure that with title insurance that there's a reissue rate. If the house is a resale, you know the seller had title insurance, so you don't want to pay for a full new policy if you don't have to. So you need to make sure that the seller has given a copy of their previous policy, or that the attorney has found the previous policy to give you a reissue rate, which will save your client money. These are things that we need to make sure of and that we're doing so that we can help our people go into their new home. As a summary, we have talked about what our responsibility is to our principal, buyers and sellers. It is up to us to make sure that our buyer and our seller are happy with the transaction and that we make it as smooth as possible. I'm not going to tell you that every situation is going to run perfect. It won't, and we all know that. But it is up to us to make sure that we do everything on our part to assist our principals to get there. We need to make sure that how much time from the contract to the closing is enough time to get everything done for as far as inspections, to make sure that the loan can be done, because we know that the loan is not part of our due diligence. We know that the loan is something that is not always going to be approved during due diligence period, but we need to make sure that the loan process is well in advance and make sure there's not going to be any glitches to get us to the end. Where there are, make sure that we have gotten an extension to make sure that everything's taken care of. We need to make sure that all the inspections, the appraisals, loan qualification surveys, title searches are done, and these should all be done during due diligence or as much as possible. Make sure everything is running as smooth as we can. And I need to let y'all take a break, and what we're going to do is in the next hour we're going to talk about the actual closing procedures and the settlements and more about title insurance and how important it is. So if you will, go take a break, and I will see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you.